A bunch of you told me that the troll infectionau created by chair noises was really creepy, and I didn't believe you at first because I couldn't imagine a cute cartoon about singing and dancing trolls was going to be scary at all. But I should have listened because this AU is definitely one of the creepier and just more disturbing ones that I've read so far. And with that being said, this AU doesn't waste any time getting started. The first thing that we see is that Branch and Creek have gone missing, and many of the trolls have already fallen victim to some type of infection. Guy Diamond seems to still be healthy and has been tasked with taking care of the uninfected children because Queen Poppy has gone into a state of depression because the number of infected trolls have started to get out of hand, and also because Branch is missing. And for those of you that may not be familiar with the troll movies, Branch and Poppy are basically a couple. We also see that King Peppy has fallen victim to the infection as well, and we learn how here. Apparently, he was helping to treat Creek's wounds when he returned from the forest, but it seems like just by touching Creek, King Peppy was infected, which right off the bat makes this infection more dangerous than some of the other ones that we've read so far, simply because the infected people don't have to attack you in order to infect you. All they have to do is just get into contact with you, and then you're sick. And with this knowledge, the king ordered all the healthy trolls into Branch's bunker as a way to kind of slow the spread of the infection. But later on, it seems like Creek suddenly went missing again. And since the king is already infected and he doesn't just want to wait around and hide from this issue, he decided to actually go out and try to find Branch and Creek himself, telling no one of his little solo mission. And at the end of the chapter, he finds Creek. And this is when I knew that this AU was going to be creepy, because this image right here is absolute nightmare fuel. In chapter 2, we're introduced to Bridget, who is a Bergen, and at the moment, it seems like they are immune to whatever virus is floating around right now, which kind of makes sense considering how much larger they are compared to the trolls. Bridget and the rest of Bergen Town actually offers to allow the sick trolls to come there for medical care, and Bridget has even offered to allow Poppy to come and stay with her in the castle. We also see Biggie here, and it seems like when the trolls were being transferred over to Bergen Town, he lost Mr. Dinkles. And this is why he's kind of freaking out here, and his sanity is down to 40%. And if you remember in the movie, these two were pretty much inseparable, and that would kind of explain why he's freaking out. Now, something that stands out in his stat sheet is the fact that his status says negative, but it also has a question mark, showing that his dwindling sanity may not just be from losing Mr. Dinkles, but also from the infection actually setting in. In any case, this guy isn't able to sleep and ends up disappearing in the night, just like Branch and Creek did. Next, we get our first look at Cooper, who is already at stage 2, and it seems like he was one of the first characters to be infected, and we learn that the symptoms include white mold growing out of their fur, frantic pacing, color loss, body swelling, tooth decay, and vomiting. And one of the symptoms that I found the most odd is that they keep asking to take a bath. And this is my theory about this as of now. My first thought was that this virus was some type of cordyceps fungus like in The Last of Us. And since the trolls are so small, I assume that the regular fungus could infect them just like it does with insects and spiders, slowly taking over their bodies and turning them into mindless zombies. But after reading about the body swelling and the need for water, or aka a bath, I think that they also could be infected with like a hairworm or some type of parasite that is in that same family. And for those of you that don't know, a hairworm basically digs into the body of insects and then forces them to seek out water to drown themselves, and then the worm goes and mates in the water or fully matures in the water, makes its way back to a muddy area so it can latch onto another insect and basically do the whole process again. But in my mind, this kind of helps me make sense of why the trolls are just getting up and leaving and why they keep having this desire for water. I feel like whatever this fungus or parasite is craving water in order for it to mature or to grow to its full capacity. And while I'm not saying for sure that that is what happened with Branch and Creek, I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case, especially when you consider that they're all still missing. But we do get to see that Biggie goes out to find Mr. Dinkles, and I honestly can't tell if this worm is dead here or infected, but I know that he looks terrible. In chapter 3, we see a few weeks have passed and Bergen Town has become the facility for medical assistance and virus research. And while the Bergens still seem to be immune, they have learned that other species are able to catch this virus, which explains what happened to Mr. Dinkles. And with this knowledge, the citizens are preparing to go on a county-wide lockdown, kind of like we had to do when the 19 hit. And they are going down this route because the virus is spreading faster and they still have no idea how to treat it. We also see that Barb is on her way to see Poppy, and it seems like she's unaware of the virus. She basically just assumed that Poppy was just ignoring her all this time. But I think what is even more interesting is Floyd's stat chart here, which states that he fled Pop Village weeks before the first recorded outbreak and barricaded himself in his home. And his only contact with the outside world has been the internet. And low-key, that is me half the time, and there's no virus keeping me in the house. But all jokes aside, this character does seem to know more about what's going on than the other people. But what I don't understand is why he didn't warn anyone if he had knowledge of what was coming. I also found it interesting that he says, "Please not the prisons." And I think that he's actually referring to the twins here, Velvet and Veneer, but it's hard to say for sure at this point in the series. Next we see Delta Dawn, and she is at stage 3 of the infection, and we see that her sanity and her health are unknown, but I find it interesting that her thirst is at 0, meaning that she is craving water. And with that knowledge, it makes sense that her citizens found her inside the lonesome flat water tower. And when they tried to take her away from the water, she started to lash out at her own people. Another thing that stands out about Delta is that she seems to be more swollen than other infecteds have been up to this point, and she even has something squirming under her skin, which furthers my belief that this virus is some kind of like weird mix between cordyceps and a parasite like the hairworm. She also states that there isn't enough space, and I assume that she's saying that there isn't enough space for her to release whatever inside of her, or for her to like evolve into another form. But I think my first thought is correct. Something is trying to get out of her, but there's not enough space to actually grow out. Next, we see that Techno Reef has fallen, and this makes sense to me because we know that the virus is affecting all trolls and seems to want to be near water or in the water. So it's no surprise that the Techno Reef didn't stand a chance here, considering that they are literally in the water. Now, some good news is that Poppy seems to be in better spirits, considering that now she is in the castle with Bridget and Gristle, and she sees all the effort that they're putting into actually finding a cure and just helping the trolls in general. She's obviously still sad that Branch is nowhere to be found though. After that, we see that Vibe City is likely going to fall. The King and Queen, Essence and Quincy, have both become sick and have already lost both of their sons and have pretty much given up hope at this point and are just waiting for the virus to take them, which is actually really sad. Like, this scene was kind of heartbreaking. And to add to the sadness, we see that Symphonyville has also fallen, and this was the home of the classical music trolls. We also see this slide that states that contaminated items need to be burned, but plastic doesn't burn, it melts. And then we get to see this ominous image of Rageous Mountain going up in smoke. And I have to wonder if this is foreshadowing as to what is going to happen to Velvet and Veneer. After that, we see Barb run into some trouble, telling someone to get their hands off of her. And then we see this image of her completely drenched and in an area with water on the ground. And then we see who she's running from. And I have to admit, the visuals in this AU are top tier. Even though all you can really see is the face and the liquid coming out of the nose and mouth, it's enough to create a terrifying visage. Next, we have a video here that explained a lot about what is happening in this AU.
This is a public announcement brought to you by the Bergen Town Medical Sciences Facility. In light of current events, there has been growing public concern for health and safety. Questions we've been asked are, what is this disease? Can this disease infect other species? How can we stop the spread of this disease? Do we have an answer to any of these questions? Our research facility's top medical scientists have worked remarkably to prove, yes. Here, we are fully confident that you will have all information that you will need to know on current events. Much mystery has been circled around this current illness. Now we know everything. Despite popular belief, this is not a virus. Current studies have concluded that we are seeing the work of a pathogenic fungus. The DMS facilities have labeled the newly identified sickness as the Pontus fungus. Pontus is a multicellular pathogenic fungus that changes behavior within hosts. Desired hosts are small organisms made up of soft tissues that the fungus can expand inside and break through after maturation. Despite desiring small hosts, Pontus is a zoonotic pathogen that can infect several species of different sizes, however symptoms vary. Troll species infected may show early symptoms of swelling, hair loss, self-destruction, and leaching fungal matter through orifices. Trolls are the most vulnerable to the disease, with risk of severe injuries and even death. The majority of prioritized patients within Bergen Town borders are severely infected trolls. Infected patients must be quarantined, due to spores easily spreading through skin-to-skin contact. Vacationers species infected may only show mild symptoms of eye discomfort, eye discoloration, and tearing of the eyes. Sinus issues may also occur. Vacationers are much less vulnerable to punctures, and will only show slight and temporary irritation. However, many patients are still accepted for treatment. Majority of miscellaneous species are immune. Some show only minor symptoms similar to that of vacationers, and are of less priority within our medical facilities, however are still eligible patients within our borders. Regions are banned from entrance. There are many ways that you can help our friends and our community. Remember to mask up, wash your hands, keep a proper distance from others, and be a helping hand for those in need. Finding the cure starts with you. To learn more, go to www.dmsfacilities.gov/how to.
It's in the water. 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 It's in the
We interrupt our current program by the demand of the Bergen Town State Militia. This is an emergency announcement to alert Bergen Town residents. This is not a drill. All programs have been interrupted. Please listen carefully for further instructions.
Attention Bergen Town residents. At 2:53 a.m. February 4th, authorities have been alerted to a recent surge of Rayjuan sightings in the northern Bergen Town area. These incidents pose a serious threat to public safety. We urge all residents to stay inside and exercise extreme caution at all times. Local law enforcement agencies are actively investigating these incidents and deploying additional resources to address the situation. However, we urge everyone to take proactive measures to safeguard themselves and their families through the following methods: lock all doors and windows, turn off all room lights, gather everyone away from doors and windows. Additionally, we encourage residents to remain armed with a lethal weapon and to keep fully covered if available. You hear knocking at any door or window? Do not answer. Remain calm and stay out of sight. Has entered your home. Do not panic. Remain calm and stay out of sight. You have been cornered by a Rayjuan. Fight and do not let the Rayjuan leave open wounds. You possess a firearm and spot a Rayjuan at any location. Aim and fire the target on sight. Do not stop until the Rayjuan is no longer moving. If you witness any suspicious activity or signs of an attack, please do not hesitate to contact emergency services immediately. Your cooperation is crucial in ensuring the safety and security of our community. We advise avoiding isolated areas, traveling in groups whenever possible, and refraining from engaging with any potential infected threats. Please stay tuned to local news outlets and official channels for updates and safety advisories. Together, we can work to mitigate this threat and protect our community from harm. Stay safe. Remember, finding the cure starts with you.
The first thing that stood out for me in this video is that we learned that the infection is caused by a pathogenic fungus, likely being mold, which would explain how the infection can spread through touch. Because if you touch mold, spores are actually released, and if they get onto the trolls or if they breathe them in, they will likely be infected. So actually very much like The Last of Us in that respect. Another thing that I want to point out is that while a lot of the other races are only slightly affected by this infection, it seems like the Radians experience a really bad reaction, maybe even worse than the Trolls, considering that they seem to actually go out and hunt people down. But we'll have to wait and see for sure in the later chapters. With that being said, in the next chapter, we see that people are really starting to go into panic mode, especially since clean water is becoming harder to get. But the good news is that people have learned that the infected trolls may look spooky, but in actuality, they're not trying to harm people actively, unless the person comes into their territory or tries to stop them from getting to water, so that the fungus can go ahead and mature or grow out of the person's body. And then we get this crazy image here that definitely reminds me of the hairworm parasite. But I think what is more important in this chapter is that we learn that the Radians are also being infected by this fungus, and since they are made out of vinyl, which is basically just really flexible plastic, and on top of that, they also have no organs inside of them, so this fungus can move in and just keep growing and stretching the Radians out until they turn into a completely different creature, which we get to see at the end of this chapter here. Now, I also want to highlight that most of the members of the Brozone appear in this chapter as well, and we see that Branch is still alive, although he has a question mark on his status, meaning that he very well may be infected. We also learn that he's responsible for his team getting stuck on the mountain here, surrounded by all these affected Radians. But unlike some of the other members of his group, he has not given up hope and is out fighting and looking for supplies with the hope that he'll be able to get back to Poppy at some point. We also see Viva here, and I notice that her sanity is really low, and it also seems like she is losing control of her body and having random fainting spells. And just like Branch, she also has a question mark on her infection status. And while the other three seem to all be clean, I find it interesting that Clay seems to be thriving in this new world, even taking time to babysit and read to the children. And then we see this quote here that says, "Stay gold, pony boy." Put down in the comments if you know what book this quote is from. And the last thing that I want to mention here is that Kid Ritz actually seems to have survived by hiding in the corner of a walk-in freezer, and this makes a lot of sense to me. Radians are made out of vinyl, and if vinyl is exposed to like freezing temperature, it becomes very brittle and easy to break. So while these creatures may be powerful, at least there is one obvious weakness that they have. Next, we see Veneer is having a bit of a breakdown, and it seems that he believes that he is the person that actually caused the Radians to fall victim to this infection. And then we get this image of him crying on the prison floor, apologizing over and over again to his sister, whom is a absolute monster at this point. And in the next chapter, we get an animated version of this image. And while it seems like his sister is trying to get in there and attack him, something else that stood out is the fact that she is still able to speak, which means that her mind hasn't been completely taken over by the fungus yet, even though her body is obviously toast. In the next chapter, we see that Bridget and Gristle come to speak with Poppy, and the topic is if they can actually save Branch or not. It seems like he was able to broadcast a message, and Poppy wants the king to use some of his resources to help find him, but it seems like the Bergens are already stretched too thin for that. And Poppy is not able to accept this and goes off on her own to try to find Branch. And while the little king is putting in a lot of work for the trolls, Poppy thinks that he's incompetent and is not doing all that he can do. So Poppy sets off on her own with a pair of scissors and starts cutting down any infected that block her path as she's searching for Branch. And you could tell that she's going down a dark road here because her hair is starting to turn gray, which basically means that she's falling into like a depression. Now, what Poppy doesn't know is that Gristle actually wanted to help her, but some of the children in his kingdom have started disappearing, and considering how many resources they've already used to help the trolls, he cannot really be expected to spend more to look for one troll, aka Branch. So while I do understand why Poppy is mad, I think this little king is actually making the right choice for his people here. And if we're being honest, Poppy is the one that's being kind of selfish here, especially considering that she doesn't even warn her own citizens that she's leaving. And speaking of missing children, we also see Guy Diamond goes into a panic because some of the troll children are missing as well, specifically Tiny and Keith. And probably the most heartbreaking part in this chapter is the fact that Satin ends up getting infected while Chanel is somehow able to stay clean. But since the pair of them are combined by the hair, they have to be separated so that Satin doesn't infect her sister or hurt anyone else. And even though Chanel understands the severity of the situation, she has made it clear that she refuses to cut her hair, stating that she will stay by Satin's side. She also has a line where she says, "It's a strange feeling to be grieving over someone whom you haven't lost yet," which is a line that truly broke me. In the next chapter, we see Tiny running through the woods screaming for his father until he runs into a dead end. Then he sees Keith hiding inside a tree hollow, telling him to be quiet. And in the distance, he can see Barb, and it's hard to tell if she is being torn apart or if she is fusing with another creature, but by the looks on her face here, she is definitely still conscious and aware and is in a ton of pain. But what I'm thinking is that she ended up getting infected, and this is kind of what happens once the infection reaches the mature stage and is starting to burst out of the person's body. Then after that scene, Tiny hears something growling, and while he tries to hide behind a tree, the monster already has his scent. But before it can actually eat him, a gunshot rings out and puts the monster down. And we see that whoever this is holding the gun upside down like Death the Kid from Soul Eater. Most of y'all are probably too young to remember that one. And interestingly enough, we see that whoever this person is doesn't seem to be interested in hurting Tiny, but instead picks up the corpse so that he can feed it to a girl that is starving. And while I have a theory of who this may be, I think the next chapter is going to reveal it for sure. And based on the scene that we just watched, it seems like the person who saved Tiny is likely Veneer. And I say this because he's holding the gun upside down here, just like the man in the woods was. We also learn here that Velvet still has her mind to some degree, and at the very least, doesn't want to harm her brother. And most importantly, Veneer is immune somehow, although based on what we see in the animation, it seems like he has something to do with starting this infection. And on a side note here, a lot of people noticed that he was drinking out of the toilet here, or the top part of the toilet, and people were saying that the toilet water is the cure, and I don't think that's the actual case. You have to remember that up to this point, they've been locked in a prison, and it seems like there was no one there to actually give them food or water. So he may just have been drinking out of that part of the toilet because the water there is clean, and it's the only option that he had. In part 8, we see that the Bergens that Queen Bridget sent out to find the missing children have finally found Keith and Tiny, and surprisingly, the two are unharmed. And I say this because there are probably other infected in the woods or just regular beasts or something like that. So the fact that the kids are completely unharmed is kind of a miracle. Now, when they try to question the boys about what happened, they can only say that a tall man helped them, who again, I believe is Veneer. And the fact that the gun here is leopard print just feels like it's right up his alley, if we're being honest. Now, that is the only good news we get in this chapter, because next we see that a ton of Bergen children are still missing and more are disappearing at an alarming rate. And if that wasn't bad enough, trolls are also still going missing, and the most important part here is that Queen Poppy is gone. And since she left without telling anyone, she has created a firestorm in the town, causing a lot of her citizens to become outraged. And the matter gets even worse because the trolls are starting to not trust Gristle and Bridget's leadership. And it doesn't help that Chef is actually working on a disposal team, which basically means that she's in charge of getting rid of the bodies once the infected trolls die. But people don't trust her because she was one of the Bergens that was trying to round up trolls and feed them to the king in the troll movie. So you can imagine that a lot of people think that maybe the trolls aren't dying, but she's probably just taking the weak trolls away and eating them or feeding them to other Bergens. So with all this information, we can now understand why the trolls are starting to organize against the Bergens, with Smidge leading them. And her plan is basically to help them defend against the mistreatment that they feel like they're getting in Bergen Town, while also setting them up so that they can actually try to escape the town later. And Guy has been recruited to help her because he's distraught over the fact that even though his son is back in town, they've put him in quarantine and they refuse to allow him to see his son. And when we look at Tiny's sheet, we see that he even had to cut his hair, and I think it was his choice because basically he didn't want any spores to be in there or fungus to be in there that would get him infected at some point. Now, after all that, it looks like Guy and Smidge were able to actually get a hold of the children and escape the town. And they were able to find a troll safe haven to leave the children at. But Guy and Smidge couldn't stay as well because the haven was already at capacity. And this was a really heart-wrenching moment because Guy literally gives his son the clothes off his back because that's all that he really had to give. And I don't know, maybe I'm just a softie, but this is just like a good example of like a parent's love. Now, as Guy and Smidge are walking away, they hear some rustling and sobbing in the distance, and then we see this infected Regen named Rachel stalking them through the forest. And her face is absolutely hideous. And in the next chapter, we actually get a full animation with her.
In the frost, it rests in peace with skin stolen from the children, like a beautiful dove in snow, quietly, alone, afraid, asleep. Where are the mothers, the owners who've manifested the children who now sleep in the snow? Why do you blame me? I'm scared of the feet I walk with, the teeth I grew in. I want to cry too.
And it seems like Rachel is referring to some of the missing children in her speech. And while some of the children have been found, I don't think it's a stretch to believe that the infected may actually be eating some of them. The other thing that caught my attention here is that Rachel seems to be very aware of her situation and is scared of the changes that are coming over her body. The creator did a great job of making me actually feel pity for this girl while also being freaked out by her appearance at the same time. Now, the final chapter of the series, we learn that more Bergens and trolls are disappearing, and the divide between the trolls and the Bergens are getting worse by the day. We also see that the older generation of Regens are also lashing out because a lot of their children are getting infected, and they want the Bergens to help since they have like all this medical knowledge and a medical center. Then we see this scene where Bridget is laying in bed with the king, and she's talking about how it's taken some getting used to being the person or the people that everyone's running to now for help, when originally everybody would run away from them. And she also remarks how like Gristle must have everything under control because how else would he be able to sleep so well? And the answer is that he isn't sleeping well at all. As his face shows right here, this little guy has been under a ton of stress from the beginning and is doing the best that he can. And I really feel bad for him because even though he set up a medical center for the infected trolls, opened his town and his castle up to the clean trolls, and found a bunch of missing children, there are still people that are saying that he isn't doing enough. And it almost feels like no matter how good he does, it will never be enough to please everybody. And this is likely why he keeps having thoughts about stepping down as king. But personally, I think this little guy is doing a pretty good job overall. After that, we see that the creator leaves us with a bit of a preview for the upcoming part, and we have this line here that says, "A horrible face is better than sharing yours." And it is hard to say like what this is referring to, but maybe it's a reference to Veneer and Velvet. Earlier in the series, I mentioned that it sounded like Veneer had something to do with the creation of the infection. He claims that he wanted to have the spotlight, so maybe he planned to turn himself into some type of monster in the hopes that he would be able to get some shine or separate himself from his sister. But instead, he ended up infecting everybody else because he just happened to be immune to whatever this fungus is. But all in all, I was pleasantly surprised by the infectionau. I love the concept of having zombies that still seem to be sentient and even able to speak and kind of understand like what they're going through in real time. I feel like a lot of people don't pursue that angle of like zombies enough, and it's a really good one. I also love that the infection is actually a mix between like a parasite and a fungus. I just assumed they was gonna be like a Last of Us situation, but the creator did so much more with it, and I love that. This AU is definitely top 2 for me as far as all the infectionaus that I've seen so far. And in the future, I would assume that they're going to have to put down these regions in order to stop this infection, because I don't see any other way that they can do it. And I'm thinking that Branch is probably going to play a bigger role in this second part that is coming out. But for now, we'll just have to wait and see when they release. And when they do, I will definitely be covering those. But if you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out this video on the screen here. Subscribe today to become a member of the Ors Force, and recommend more infectionaus for me. I am loving covering these. As always, thanks for watching. Peace, peace.